Hey everyone, welcome to Aionics Fortnightly number 3. Excited to have everyone back, and today we're going to be discussing supercharging the scientific method with AI. And I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see my slides. Can everyone see that? Cool. So I want to talk about this. I think it's important in the work that we do to frame how AI and machine learning are really not enabling us to do anything that's like fundamentally crazy, new, different. It's really just enabling us to be more effective in this existing scientific methodology framework that's been around for hundreds of years. And the first time I ever heard of the term AI was from this movie from like 2000 with Haley Joel Osment, where he plays like a sentient like child AI robot. Anyone ever see that movie? I don't think it was very good. But that was the first time I ever heard the word AI, and I think like sometimes I think about that. I think about his character as the AI, where it's like, what happens if Haley Joel Osment as a robot starts doing stuff, like in this case, starts doing science? Like, how does that actually play out? So in order to discuss that, I think that this is something that in our company, in our field, we think about a lot, but I think for those who may be interested in this space and just kind of getting started thinking about how does this actually kind of fit in with what I am already doing in my scientific efforts, this is hopefully will be an introduction to how these approaches are really just enabling more effective science rather than something that's kind of like fundamentally crazy, new, and different. So to start, take it way back to the creation of the scientific method. It is credited to Sir Francis Bacon, who lived around the end of the 1500s. Beginning of the 1600s. It's kind of weird to say who invented the scientific method, because I think really no one really invented it. I mean, it's just a process for trying to be as objective as possible. But it really kind of came around in the beginning of the scientific revolution and led to all of the developments that we have today. The scientific method, I'm going to put Lenson on the spot, Dr. Lenson. Can you give us an overview of the scientific method?
It's not nice. Reality based on evidence. How about that?
All right, that was much more effective than I thought. Answer per word ratio, very high. Yes, so that's basically all it is, right? It's like just using evidence, using empirical observations to understand what's going on. I think there's typically sort of 3 steps here. So the first one is make some observation about the world, form a hypothesis about what's going on, and then test the hypothesis. And then iterate until you get your answer. So for us, let's take the context that we usually work in, which is materials design. I'm specifically using an example around electrolyte design. Let's say our observation is that some electrolytes extend cycle life in a battery and some don't. Okay, why is that? There's just some differential performance. Well, there's probably some molecular features in some of these electrolytes that promote cycling high performance in batteries, and then some that don't. And once we figure that out, then we can find a new molecule that satisfies those requirements, test it. If it works, then our hypothesis was right. If not, we go back to the drawing board. So again, just a very, very, I would say, simple process for trying to be objective and figuring out what's actually happening. Now, when it comes to molecules, I wanted to start with a simple and very unrealistic example just to illustrate this point. So let's say that we have a molecule in our electrolyte that looks something like this, and we observe cycle life of 200 cycles in that battery. Then when we add an extra oxygen in there, now we're going up to 250. We're adding a third oxygen, we're going up to 300. And ultimately, let's say we want to get to 500 cycles. Well, it looks like there's a trend here, right? It looks like the more oxygens we're putting in there, the better the cycle life is getting. So coming back to our scientific methodology, our observation is that, again, different molecules are giving different performance. Adding more oxygens is increasing the cycle life. And if we want to get cycle life as high as possible, well, shoot, let's just try a molecule with as many oxygens as we can. I'm no chemist, but I'm pretty sure this molecule doesn't exist. Lenson, can you confirm? There seems like there's just too many things wrong with it, but it does satisfy our design principle that we have here. So let's say that we're like, okay, cool. My lab partner, found this molecule, and we're gonna throw it into the electrolyte and see what happens. Now let's say that we are shocked and heartbroken to find out that electrolyte only gives us 100 cycles. So it's like, we thought we had the silver bullet here, but it turns out that we don't. So now we have to go back to the drawing board. So our hypothesis was wrong. So we began by making an observation that different molecules give different cycle life performance. Our hypothesis was cycle life will increase as the number of oxygens increases. That was really all that was different between all of those molecules. So that was like the only kind of thing that we could tease out as potentially relevant to performance. But then our next experiment showed us that, well, it only increases from 1 to 3 oxygens, but then it seems like it goes down. So now our new hypothesis is, well, maybe somewhere between 3 and 10 is the optimal number. And so you can see this, basically this iteration just continues until you have found the answer. So where I'm going with this is that this step of forming these hypotheses, which we've just walked through, the first hypothesis being as many oxygens as possible, the second hypothesis being somewhere between 3 and 10, really all that we're doing there is we're just interpreting data. So hypothesis formation it involves data interpretation. So our first hypothesis, we were looking at these data, we had 3 data points. So we had 3 electrolytes. Each electrolyte had an increasing number of oxygens and an increasing cycle life. So we can look at that and say, well, where's that trend pointed? Well, we just draw this line through here and we say, okay, as many oxygens as possible gives us the best cycle life possible. But then we get this new data point here and we say, okay, well, this is no longer a line. Now it looks like that line is like bending back over. And lo and behold, our maximum is probably somewhere in here. You can imagine there's a ton of different ways to draw a line through these 4 data points. That's part of I would say, the art of machine learning and modeling. But the point here is that the way that you draw that line is an essential part of how you can extract a hypothesis. So it all comes back to data analysis, and that's why this AI machine learning field is so valuable, I think, to the process of carrying out the scientific method. So if it was really just that simple, just you add oxygens and then you have this molecule with 10 oxygens, life would be a lot easier. The problem is that these systems that we work with are incredibly complicated. Not only are those features of the molecules unclear oftentimes, but we have tons of molecules mixed together. And we have these interactions that we may not understand or may not know what's going on. So a typical, I would say even a simple electrolyte in a real case is not just a molecule with a bunch of oxygens. You're typically going to have things mixed together like ethylene carbonate, dimethyl carbonate, and vinylene carbonate, and lithium hexafluorophosphate. And you can see that there's like all kinds of bonds and salts and all kinds of stuff. So when we're faced with this question of like, okay, well, we slightly increase the concentration of the salt, what is that going to do? Or maybe we increase the relative concentration of dimethyl carbonate, it's really complicated. And so our ability to answer that question really depends on how well we can do that hypothesis formation and interpretation that we were just mentioning. And the example case is almost never it's almost never that simple. So in those complicated cases, that is where we have to turn from our scientific intuition into, or towards, I should say, this approach of materials informatics. And this is where Haley Joel Osment comes in to save the day. So a few points that I wanted to make are, the first one is that materials informatics approaches use automated computation, or really just machine learning and AI, to quickly identify and test thousands or millions of hypotheses, and to identify the best ones. And that gives us as practitioners, or in our case, our customers, our clients, what we might say like superhuman capabilities to assess different hypotheses about their data. And ideally, we want to look for hypotheses that are quick to assess, so that if we find out that they work, then we can apply them very rapidly to millions of candidates, like we often do. And the tricky part is that we don't know what those hypotheses are a priori, so we have to use that existing data to look for them. So a practitioner might have some kind of molecular structure input, so some data set that says here's a bunch of different molecules, and then those molecules get put into a cell, and this test happened, and you get uncontrollable, unpredictable chemistry happening, and then you get some performance output. We don't really know, or maybe can't model that process. This materials informatics gives us a way of just linking input directly to output, and that requires iterating through a ton of different hypotheses. So really, I would say, and this is, I think this is my final slide before showing another example, but just a final slide on this thought, is that machine learning is going to enable new science. One of my favorite definitions of machine learning is this quote, that it's the science of getting computers to act without being explicitly programmed. In our case, we are not programming a computer to predict how an electrolyte performs, because frankly, we don't know. If you start changing things, assumptions start to break down, physical models may not hold. Models built on lithium batteries may not hold for sodium batteries. So we want to just get away completely from programming the computer to make assumptions, to make predictions. We're going to let it just learn from the data. And so that's how these input observations, these data sets, are fed to an algorithm. Millions potentially of hypotheses are explored. This data analysis is done, and once we have the best answers, then we can get to those output recommendations. So I think in cases where the hypotheses are not straightforward and there's a lot to test, that's really where the value of AI and machine learning can come in. So I think the point there is just to emphasize that that science is inherently empirical, meaning that science is done by taking observations, taking data on the real world, and computers enable us to analyze that data much more effectively. So pre-computers, one of my favorite examples of I would say informatics before informatics is Kepler. Now, Kepler lived in the late, actually right around the same time as Sir Francis Bacon, late 1500s, early 1600s. And here's another pop quiz. Does anyone remember what Kepler's main contributions were? This is a tough one. He's sandwiched between two very famous scientists. So he came right after Copernicus and right before Newton. So I think he kind of gets glossed over. But I'm curious if anyone remembers from high school what Kepler did. I won't, no judgment if you don't know.
I don't know, but I'm going to guess elliptical orbits or something like that.
Okay, any other guesses? That's a pretty good guess. So that is one, that's correct. That's one of his contributions. Nicely done. So he worked on the motion of the planets. Copernicus was the one who proposed the heliocentric model. So sun's in the middle, planets are going around. Newton, who came after him, developed the universal law of gravitation. So Kepler was working without that universal law of gravitation. It didn't come for centuries after his death, and still was able to figure out like really fundamental stuff about the planets, which is really pretty cool. So Kepler has three laws of planetary motion. One of which is that the planets generally move in ellipses. The second one has to do with planets like sweeping out certain areas over time of the ellipse. I always forget that one. The third one, which is the subject of what I'm about to say next, is he found a relationship between the orbital radius of a planet. So like how far, let's say how far a planet is from the sun, and how long it takes how long it takes the planet to move around the sun. And he found it's a universal relationship for any orbiting body. So if you know how far an orbiting body is from what it's orbiting, you can actually compute how fast it's going to take, or how quickly it will get around the thing that it's orbiting, because those two numbers are correlated in basically anything that's orbiting in space. Now, the way that he figured this out is fascinating. So he wrote he wrote like a book after he figured it out, where he said he actually just played with numbers for 17 years until he got the right answer. That's the short version. So I think I have, here on my next slide. So when Kepler was around, there were 6 planets. I mean, there were more than 6, but he only knew of 6. Neptune didn't exist yet a couple hundred years ago. So he had 6 data points, is the reason why I'm telling you this. So 6 different radii and 6 different orbital periods. And he just like could not figure out the connection between the two. And he labored for 17 years to do this. And he was, literally, it was like he would just try some transformation of those numbers and then would apply that to all 6 data points and see if he could get them in a line. And he just like could not do it until one day he figured it out, which is that you have to take it's the cube of the orbital radius over the square of the orbital period is a constant. So it's like you can imagine all of the permutations of things he was trying before he got to this point, unsuccessfully. And he actually figured it out I think it was earlier in the year he figured it out, but he was convinced that he made a mathematical error. So he just like put it aside. And then he came back a few months later and redid the math and realized that he had figured it out. And he has this quote about like, I believed I was dreaming because he's just been trying to figure this out for so long. The reason I'm telling this story is that I think this is a great example of what we're talking about here, which is iteration on hypotheses and validation by data. So Kepler was trying stuff, and every time he would try it, he would come up with some formulation that would link these two variables. Then he'd go back to the data and say, hey, does this work? And it's like, most of the time the answer is no. And then you go back to the data, you tweak it again. And he just is doing this iteratively and validating every time against 6 data points. So part of the reason I think this is interesting is because by any modern machine learning standard, someone's going to tell you that there's absolutely no way you could ever learn on 6 data points. Someone might have some arbitrary threshold of like, you can never learn on less than X data points, where X is 200 or 1,000 or something. I think really the answer is that it depends on how much you know about the problem, depends on how good your hypotheses are. We were able to figure this out with n equals 6, right? Which is a super small data set. But this is the type of thing. So basically all that we're doing with machine learning and AI is we're just accelerating this process. We're transforming the data in different ways. We're looking at different types of models. Maybe, so here we have a cube over a square. Maybe we could look at, I don't know, a 4th root over a 3rd root. Like there's all these different things that we could try. And we're really just accelerating that process that Kepler did. So I like to share this story because I just think it's a really fascinating historical anecdote. And with the advent of computers, I mean, it just makes all of our lives easier. So in the post-Kepler era, we're essentially doing the same thing, but we're doing it with the help of calculations, of computational calculations. So with our work, specifically coming back to this example of electrolyte design, this is actually a real case study from our work, but represents, I think, a pretty standard kind of example of something that we see, which is you start with around 200 formulations, different electrolyte formulations with cycle life values. The question is, how do you correlate those two? This is a screenshot of a data set, which I have redacted. So it's just a giant black square. So it's like not very helpful, but there's data behind the black square. Our process is to extract those features, right? Extract the hypotheses. In this case, we did that through the RDKit Mordred molecular featurizer, which gives us over 1,000 unique pieces of information for each formulation. Those in themselves kind of represent a hypothesis. So like a feature or a hypothesis would be, hey, the number of, actually, let's come back to our oxygen example. This is actually a real thing in this case. Number of oxygens in your electrolyte molecules might predict performance. And usually the answer is that it's not a good predictor. But if you start combining these things into clever ways, then you start to get a complex hypothesis, which might give you some good predictive power. That's where the model building process comes in. So in this case, we did recursive feature elimination to get rid of some features, and then trained a Gaussian process Bayesian optimizer to predict performance. So we're coming up with a more complex hypothesis. And once we believe in that, and once we found that does predict what we care about, then we can apply it to optimize our formulation by screening candidates. And in this particular case, we found that 200 data points was actually sufficient to give a model with quite good predictive power. And that was validated against experiments that were done after the model was built, after the formulations were screened. And if they were perfect predictions, they would lie along this diagonal line. You can see there's a little bit of noise, but our estimate was that those predictions were about 10 times more effective, or the model was 10 times, had a 10x better signal than if it was just learning on random noise. So there really is some significant understanding that can come out of learning from a data set as small as 200 data points. So it's all about this hypothesis generation and validation. And that's really what our platform is doing, and is trying to make as easy as possible for the user. Is let's generate a ton of hypotheses for you, and let's test them. And the calculation of features and the validation of those models can be done in a typical data set, within the span of a few minutes, versus 17 years of writing those numbers down on paper. Not to compare us to Kepler, but so my parting thoughts from this, and then I will open up for if anyone has any thoughts or questions or anything, is just a few points. So the point that I've made, that I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the point is that machine learning, or AI, which I've been kind of using those interchangeably, allow us to develop and test hypotheses in a essentially automated manner. So science is still being done the way that science has always been done, the way that Sir Francis Bacon envisioned science being done. It's just being done, part of it is just being done in a much more effective and automated way. But you're always going to need some of those observations of the real world, in other words, that training set, to validate those hypotheses against. So you can't just predict the stuff out of the blue and it's going to be right and never validated. I mean, it just doesn't really work that way. And then coming back to Kepler's example of n equals 6, a common question that we are asked is how big of a data set do you need? And I think the answer is that it's very dependent on the problem, and it's very dependent on how much you know about the problem. So Kepler knew, for example, that the orbital period was probably a good predictor of the orbital radius. if he had tried to predict the orbital period from like the outdoor temperature on any given day, he would have never been able to find a model. And so, but if you're starting with really good guesses, then you could probably get away with validating on a smaller data set. And really, that final point is that science as it is done today and as it has been done will not go away. I think it's really just going to become more effective through the use of these approaches. And I think that's right in line with our mission at Aionics. So that's my final slide. And I will pause here and see if anyone's got any deep reflections on the meaning of life and Haley Joel Osment.
Just a quick remark on Kepler's patience for 17 years, on permutating numbers and finally getting his result to work. That was interesting.
I know I can't do that for more than like 3 days, and then I just give up.
Yeah, I imagined 17 years when you said 17 years. I took back the clock and I tried to place myself in his shoes to see if I could actually get myself doing something like that. But that was impressive. 17 years.
Another good example is Edison in inventing the light bulb. Was I don't know if it was him or others who have studied him have estimated that he tried about 10,000 different things before he found the thing that worked, and tried like everything in the book, and just eventually found something that lit up when you put a voltage across it. And so it's pretty amazing. I mean, we tend to forget how much work those old school scientists did.
Yeah, and we little or no computers.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. They didn't have internet issues back then, so they had to focus on some important things.
Yeah, they were probably able to focus for longer periods of time because they're yeah.
Distraction was little.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice talk, Austin.
Thanks.
One thing that occurred to me was just thinking about the scientific method and thinking about today and like the past 100 years or so. In the clean picture of reality, the hypothesis comes from an observation that we made, but in the more modern picture, we're starting straight from theory in a lot of cases. We have ideas about how things should work, should scale. The entire field of quantum mechanics is a great example. You didn't notice that, you can't casually make an observation that shows the way particles propagate. You have to have some crazy idea and chase it down. And that's where a lot of the most interesting science is happening now. It's a little, it's awesome. It's also I don't know how to say it, like maybe a little unfortunate. It's a little harder for to wrap your head around. And, the connection between science and reality has become like less, more tenuous over time. People find reasons to doubt that, that the theory that gives rise to a hypothesis is founded, is well founded. I don't know. That's just what came to mind while watching it. Sometimes this very clean observation hypothesis framework is idealized, and today it's like it can be a lot messier and a lot leaves a lot more room to be questioned.
I wonder if it's because we're increasingly working in a domain that's just inaccessible to most people. Like, how do you validate quantum theory at home?
Yeah, no, the problems are bigger. They're more complicated. We're well beyond it. I feel like as the 100 years, we've done a lot of what we can observe and touch with our hands.
Yeah.
And we've had to start kind of moving beyond it to make sense of the more phenomenological things about the world. And in doing so, break from what's easily understandable as reality, as the things you can touch and see and hear, and trying to convince ordinary people, the rest of society, people who are watching scientists do what they do, that these things are real and that they make sense. It's suddenly become a challenge where science is supposed to be this vehicle for objectivity. It, you know, it can become dangerously more like a vehicle for confusion. I mean, there's nothing we can really do about it. It's just interesting to me how it's become so much more complicated in the last 100 years or so.
Yeah. I think there is a conflict or a tension, I think, between the ideals of the scientific method and the execution as well. I think, like, to me, it's hard to, even when bad science is done, I don't think you can ever really blame the scientific method, because the scientific method is just an articulation of how to be as objective as possible, I think. And if someone is not objective, it's not because the scientific method led them to do that. It's because they, probably because their execution of the scientific method was not good. Yeah, so it is really hard to, I think, as scientists, I think we have to sort of work to regain public trust in that method, and say, hey, that person was they had kind of X bias or X flaw or whatever, but like the method still works. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well said.
That's a good, I think it's a very salient point. Anyone else? Well, if not, thank you all for listening. Thanks again for another great discussion. This has been really fun, and we'll part ways here, and we'll see you next time.
Sure thing.
All right. Thanks, everyone.